Okay, it is time already. So thank you very much for joining us at DrupalCon Global. This is Drupal Migrations for Non-Coders. My name is Mauricio Dinarte. I go by Dinarcon on the web, and my pronouns are he, him. The slide deck is already available in that URL, and I'm going to share it at the end as well. Everything that I'm going to present is already available, including the code examples. Um, that is my email address. If you need to get it, if you have questions after the session, feel free to email me. I am from Nicaragua. Beautiful country, 85 degrees all year round. So if you live in a cold place, you can come down here. Beautiful nature, you can go watch a lava lake like this one, or you can go to that website for a virtual tour. I collaborate with an organization called Agaric, which is based in Boston. We have members all over the place. I myself in Nicaragua, and we specialize in migrations, Drupal migration. So I invite you to check our upcoming trainings next week. But even after those dates, we usually present trainings. I am also very passionate about teaching, so I have this personal project called understanddrupal.com, where I write articles and in the future videos as well about Drupal in Spanish, English, and French. So if you speak any of those languages and want to learn more about Drupal and particularly about Drupal migrations, I have been writing a lot about that. In particular, I wrote a 31 series of articles about migrations, and I also have a course on the topic, so I invite you to check it out. And let's get it, to the topic. We're going to talk about Drupal migrations, and even though we're going to approach it from a non-developer perspective, if you have some experience with other platforms, in particular, anything that is related to ETL or extract, transform, and load, if you are familiar with that, Drupal migrations is an implementation of that API. So feel free to, if you have knowledge about this already, it applies as well. And I like to explain things by giving real life examples. So let's have a look at how we would use the Migrate API with an analogy of making bread. So when you want to make bread, you need some source ingredients or materials. So in Drupal Migrate API, that corresponds to source plugins. That means you need to have a source of your data. Is it an XML file, a JSON file, a CSV file, a SQL database, and so on. So you need some source of, raw materials, or in this case, the data that you want to get into Drupal, and those are provided by the source plugins, and it corresponds to the load operation in the ETL pattern. After you have collected everything that you want to migrate into Drupal, you need to process it and transform it. This corresponds to the transform operation. In Drupal is provided by process plugins, and we're going to see some example of that later. But basically, it's a way to mix and match. For example, if you have names that you want to combine, like different first name and last name, and you want to combine them in a single column or a single field in Drupal, using process plugins is how you are going to do that. And basically, any transformation that you need to do, this is how you do it, using process plugins. And the load operation in the ETL pattern corresponds to the destination plugins. And this is how you instruct Drupal what entities do you want to create. Do you want to create users or nodes or files or media entities or paragraph and so on? So this is how you instruct, this thing that I already collected and processed, put it in this basket or in this shelf. And this is destination plugins. And all of this, we're going to see practical examples. So when I started working with migrations, I had been doing Drupal development for about 5 years and even writing code and so on. So I remember that I thought, this is going to be easy. And then I was prompt with so many words, so many things that were very confusing to me. And I was a little bit frustrated. In the end, I just wanted to move some content into my website. And everything started to click when I started to map all these buzzwords that I didn't understand at the beginning into these process plugins, and particularly into one of these categories. Is this a source, a process, or a destination plugin? Because in every migration, you are only going to have one source and one destination. So instead of having to think about 15 things, I only care about 7, for example, using the processes that we see on the screen right now. So let's say I'm going to work only from CSV, and I'm going to create users. So I don't need to worry about any other source or any other destination. In between, I am going to use 1, 2, 5, as many process plugins as I need. One thing to note and clarify is that when I say a migration can only have one source and one destination, that is like, for example, if you want to migrate the article content type or the basic page content type. But in your migration project, you're actually going to have a lot of migrations. So some of them might be creating nodes, others might be creating users. And in the example that we're going to see later, we are going to see that every migration has one source and one destination, but to migrate the whole project, we're going to be using different files. So that's one thing to take into account. So this is a very simple example of a transformation that you want to do. Let's say that you have a CSV file with first name and last name as separate columns, and in your destination, you have a node and you have a name field, but you want to put them together. So there is a process plugin that we're going to see an example of this later that is going to be able to put them together and go from source to process to destination and follow that workflow. Before jumping into the examples, these are the most common things that I see people, having difficulties when starting with migrations. The first one is that any migration in Drupal is a two-step process. First, you need to write the YAML file, the YAML definition file, and after you have the file, you need to execute it. And this is where things started to get a little bit complicated or confusing, because to execute the migration, you have two options. From the command line, if it is a migration defined as code or configuration, or from the user interface. And we're going to see what this is. So this is a very simple migration, and this is like a fully working example. This is what a migration definition file looks like. It has an ID, which I uniquely identifies each migration in my whole project. It has a label that allows me to identify this migration in the UI and in the command line if I were to use that. And then we saw the three-step of the ETL process: my source, my process, and my destination. In my source, in this case, I am reading from a CSV file, and as you can see, it's like 3 lines. And with that, I am able to read from CSV file. In my destinations, I'm saying I want to create nodes of type UD stuff. This default bundle refers to the content type. It can be article, it can be basic page. In this particular case, it is called UD stuff. And then in my process section is where I do the mapping. So in this case, I am saying the title field of the node, I want to set it to whatever is the first name value of my CSV file. I have a column in my CSV file called first name. So on your left, you have the destination, either property like the node title or field, let's say the image field. And on the right, you have whatever comes from your source. Now, we said that migrations can be defined as code and configuration, and this is very important to understand. Migration defined as code, they work out of the box with Drupal core. You don't need anything else to work with them. And in order to use them, you create a custom module, and in that custom module, you have a migrations folder. And then the name of the file itself is going to be just like the id.yml. You can say, UD stuff CSV image.yml. If you make any change for that file, you need to reveal the caches for those changes to take effect. Let's say that after migrating the title, I want to migrate a field, then you need to clear the caches for those changes to take effect. And many times you also need to roll back and import again. And we're going to see an example of this in a moment. And in order to execute the migration, remember that this is a two-step process. You have the file already, but you also need to execute it. So you do it using the command line, and there is a module called Migrate Tools that provides drush commands to be able to execute those migrations. Another option is to have migrations defined as configuration entities. And for this, you need the Migrate Plus module enabled and installed on your website. Here, the place where you put the files is different. It's going to be config install inside your custom module. And the name pattern is also different. It's going to be migrate plus, .migration, then the ID of your migration, and then YML. Because these are configuration entities, this is basically how you manage any other configuration in your website. If you want to make any changes, you need to import or sync again. There are many ways to do that. There are drush commands that allow you to do a partial configuration import. There is the migrate config devel module that allows you to automatically import any changes as soon as you make them, or you can use the interface or any CMI related module that allows you to import again any changes will help you with this. And only migrations defined as configurations are able to be executed from the user interface, and that is using the migrate tools modules, which we're going to see later. Again, very important to understand the difference between code and configuration migrations, because if you put them in the wrong directory or with the wrong name, or you are using the wrong modules, you will not be able to execute them. And in general, some tips before jumping into the example. Start from an existing migration. It is often the case that you have some use case that might be common, so you just look for an example, make sure that the example works as expected, and then start making your changes to adapt to your specific needs. In the 31 articles series that I mentioned before, there are about 20 examples of many different things that you can just literally copy and paste, and from them start modifying to your specific needs. In general, read the official documentation. In my humble opinion, the Migrate API is one of the best documented subsystems in Drupal as a whole. Pay close attention to the syntax of your YAML definition files, even like an extra space, or if you remove a space, or the indentation is wrong, the whole migration might fail. And that is a common source of frustrations, and sometimes the errors that you get are not very descriptive. So make sure that when working with migrations, the white spaces, the syntax that you use in your YAML files is proper. When having a big migration, go one field at a time, because if you have, let's say, 10 fields at once and something breaks, you might not know when it, in which of the 10 there is a problem. But if you go one field at a time, you are making sure that any progress that you make is useful, is working, and then you can go to the next one. If you are familiar with code, you can commit every step in the way. Again, like if something breaks at some point, you can go back in the history of your Git repository and come back to this working state. Another thing is that not everything needs to be modified in the Migrate API. You might do some cleanup or preparation of the data before or after the migration. Sometimes there are edge cases that you can spend hours, if not days, trying to make to come up with a migration that takes care of everything perfectly, or you spend an hour before or after preparing your data or cleaning up your data, and you save some development time. So not everything needs to be done in the Migrate API. And if you need help, the Migrate API offers a lot of support in Slack, in the Pound migration channel, so I invite you to go there. And this is probably the most important tip that I can give you. Understand that there is a, Leah Burrow, author of CSS Secrets, says, understanding the process of finding a solution is far more valuable than the solution itself. And I mention this because the Migrate API is just like a tool set. You have so many tools that you can use for many different purposes, and it is up to you to combine them into something that works for you. Take your time to read, to understand, to play with different examples, to break on purpose things that are working, so you get familiarized with the errors. And once you understand, why things work, and when they break, why they break, you're going to have a much easier time working with migrations. So I'm going to do a live demo. Of course, nothing can go wrong, so bear with me. So before starting with the migration itself, it is very, very important to understand your source. In this case, I am going to be migrating from a CSV file. So I need to know what is the structure of my CSV file. In this case, I can see there are, a row of headers. In this case, a staff ID, first name, last name, and so on. And then I have like one record for each of them. Is the structure that I need. So always understand the source. In this case, my CSV file. Um, so this is the example that I'm going to be starting with. As you can see, all that you need is an ID, a label, a source, a process, and a destination. So this is the very basic that you need. My ID needs to be unique across the whole system. And remember the spaces that I mentioned before. If I were to remove this space, it will break. My whole migration will break. So be mindful of that. Then I am using a plugin called CSV. This is provided by a module called Migrate Source CSV. And then I need to provide the path to my file. So this is the path. If I were to inspect the hierarchy of my Drupal installation, this is where I'm going to find it. And then it expects an ID key with a list of columns in my CSV file that uniquely represent each record. In this case, I have a staff ID, and spaces are important. And if you have spaces, you need to put quotes around it. Uppercase and lowercase are also important. And something that it is not obvious here, but different versions of modules might introduce changes in the configuration. So this is the latest version, which is 3.x. If you were to use version 2.x, this value is not IDs, it's actually keys. So be mindful of the versions of the modules, Drush, Drupal, everything that you use. You should be using the latest version unless you have a very particular reason why not to do that. In this case, I'm creating notes. This is how you say that you want to create notes, and this is the content type. Most of the time, the Migrate API is going to be working with machine names. So this is the machine name of my content type. And then I am saying the title of my node populated with the first name column of my CSV file. So now that I have my migration file, and if I see the structure, I can see that I have my custom module, I have a migrations folder, and that's the name that I define. You know, I already have my module enabled, so I don't need to enable it again. I'm going to be running the migration with Drush just to save some time, but you can do it from the user interface if it is defined as code. And I'm going to show an example of that in a moment. So this is executing the migration. If I go to the website now, I can check that I have these nodes migrated. What I see here, that I see more information, is because I already have migrated other content. So for example, if I want to start from scratch, I go back to the command line and do a rollback operation. And I say I want to roll back everything. And this is very common. When you're doing a migration, you are going to often be like importing and reverting, and so on. So in this case, if I just execute my one migration that I defined before, I can see that I am getting the results that I am expecting. Something weird is happening here, and it is that I only said in my migration that I want to migrate the first name, but I'm getting something else. So the very first thing that you do if you are getting a result that you're not expecting is like making sure that you are working with the latest version of your files. In this case, I'm going to rebuild my cache because these are migration defined as code. I'm going to roll back the migration. Sometimes you can use like shortcuts or URL aliases for rolling back or importing. And if I refresh, I can see that now I'm getting the results from my CSV file. The reason why I was getting something different is because I had a previous version of that file loaded into my Drupal site, and that's why it was showing something else. So by doing this, I already have a migration working. I am already importing content, and if I were to roll back, the content would disappear. So let's say that I want to do something else. I want to put together the first name and the last name. So how do I do that? I do that using process plugins. Remember that if I said I want to combine two columns into one field or one property, I use a process plugin. So um, for the sake of the example, you just go to your search engine of choice and look for Drupal Migrate Process plugins. The first result is a documentation from Drupal.org, and you land into this website. There is a list of core Migrate Process plugins that looks promising, so I go there. After going there, everything that is provided by Drupal core out of the box. One of them says concats, and it says concatenates a set of strings. In computer parlance, concatenation is the same as putting things together. So I am going to click here, and I come to the example or the documentation of this particular process plugin. So what I'm going to do is literally copy and paste. Like I'm doing this just for the sake of the example, but I recommend that you actually read the whole thing. And I'm going to remove this and paste it here. So as you see, in the documentation, plugin, source, and delimiters are at the same level. But here, when I pasted plugin, then source and delimiter came after, like a sub property. And this is going to fail. If I don't correct this, this is going to fail. So this is just an example of when you are copying and pasting from the internet, make sure that your IDE is not doing anything extra. In this case, I am saying, I want to populate the title with whatever is the result of the plugin called concat. And then my source, what is going to be my source? Is going to be my first name column and my last name column. So again, uppercases are important. And then you can have a delimiter, which is like something that goes in between. I don't want a slash, as in the example. I want a white space. So if I want a white space, I put in quotes and then the white space there. So the workflow now for this to take effect, I'm going to roll back the migration. I am going to clear the cache, and I'm going to import again. And if I go to the website, I can see that now I have my first name and my last name concatenated. And if I were to click there, I can see the white space in between. Let's have a look at more examples of the syntax of the migration. Let's say that I not only want to put them together, but I also want to make them uppercase. So that is another transformation, but that is another transformation that I want to apply on the same property, in this case, the title. So how can you do that? You can do that using something that is called process plugin chains. So you do it like this. In this case, I am going to use a plugin called callback. I am not going to go to that documentation for the sake of brevity, but basically this callback plugin is going to allow me to call any PHP function if I want, and the way that you configure it, you will go to the documentation to know how to do it. But basically, in a callable configuration, you said what configuration you want what function you want to execute. So the way that it works is that the result of this is going to be passed to this, and the result of everything in the change, I can have as many of these as I want. I could have another one, like another plugin in the chain. They are going to be passing from one to the other, and the very last one, it is going to be assigned to the property or to the field. So in this case, I'm going to clear the cache, roll back, and import again. And if I go to the website and I refresh, I can see that everything is in uppercase, and that is what that function is actually doing. It putting things in uppercase. And let's say that we want, if we click on the node itself and we click on edit, we can see that we have a rich text field. And these are interesting because like in addition to like the text that you will enter here, you also get to define the text format. So this is something that is called a compound field. And just like what you have to do here is like migrate the source, like the value of the field, and migrate which text format you want to use. So what I'm going to use is I'm going to copy from an existing example. So again, you need to be very careful with your indentation. Like any field or property needs to be one level inside of process. Now, what I have here is the machine name of the field. And then with a slash, this is how you access the subfields. Those are called subfields. For the value, I am going to use the biography column. I have a column in my CSV file called biography, and that is what I'm going to assign. And then for the format, the text format, there is nothing in my CSV file providing that information. So what can I do? I can provide a default value. So there is a plugin called default value. And in this case, that this is the way that you configure it, default value, and then whatever you define here, it's what's going to be used by Drupal. So what I'm saying is, for the field UD biography, which is the one that we saw before, the value I want to copy from my CSV file biography column. And I want you to use the basic HTML. Again, this is the machine name. So you need to be able to find the machine name of anything that you're using. If I were to, come back, revert, clear my cache, import again, I can go to the website and verify that I am importing my different biography. And if I were to click on one of them, I can verify that I am using the basic HTML. So when you have complex fields like this one, that they have subfields, that's how you do it. You put the machine name of the field, and then a slash, and then what property you want to set. In this case, value, and then the format. Let's say that we have a multi-value field. How do we do that? And again, like the syntax is a little bit more involved. I'm going to paste and make sure that my indentation is correct. So in this case, in my CSV file, I have a column called Drupal, I have a column called GitLab, and a column called Twitter. And all of them contain URLs to different profiles from this person. And I have this constant Drupal link title. So what is that? This is something extra that you can define in your source. You can define, these are called source constants. And it's basically some variables or placeholder text that you might want to use later. So for any URL from Drupal, I want to use this text. For GitLab, I want to use this text. And for Twitter, I want to use this text. So the way that this works is like the syntax is the machine name of the field. And then because this is a multi-value field, you can say 0 for the first element, 1 for the second element, 2 for the third element, and so on. There are ways to make this dynamic. I am showing this like hard-coded 0, 1, and 2 on purpose, so you understand the syntax, but it is possible to have, one process plugin that will read an array of values and populate the fields properly. But in this case, it is machine name of the field, delta, or the element in the multi-value field, and then the subfield. So this is a link text, a link field, and links have a URI for the URL itself and a title. So again, like I make my change, I roll back, I clear my cache, I import again. And by doing so, if I go to the website, I can see that I have, my different links for the different person. Let's have a look at one of them. In this case, I am using the, as I said before, the web server that comes with Drupal core. So sometimes it freezes. So what I did is just like restarted the server. This is like very easy setup. You don't need to have many things installed for this to work properly. But this is what we saw before. We saw a multi-value field where I am populating, with 3 values. The URL is the URI subfield, and the text is the corresponding subfield. And these are the constants that I were using before. So that's basically what I am doing here. One thing that I want to show is that, I can continue the process, and you have the examples that you can, execute everything at once. But one thing that I want to show is that so far, I have been executing migrations defined as code, because for one, they are in my migrations folder, and two, I need to clear the cache for changes to take effect. But as I said before, you can also do it as configuration entities and execute the same thing from the user interface. So in order to do that, you put them in config install, you define your migrations. As you can see, it's like almost the same, and we're going to see like what are the difference in a moment. But once you have those migrations and you enable your module, you can go to the website to structure, and then you will have a migrations directory, a link. This is a group, a migration group that I define, and I can list the migrations that are part of that group. In this case, there are 3 of them, one for paragraph, one for images, and one for nodes. So I'm going to execute the node migration, and I can say rollback, import, stop, reset. In this case, I want to import. And one thing that is going to happen is that I am migrating nodes, but those nodes have associated images and paragraph. So the Migrate API is able to detect that I have dependencies from one migration to another, and I am going to get all of them executed at once. So if I go back to the site, I can see that this is what I was doing before, like manually one by one, and this is what I did from the user interface. So I have images. This is a paragraph. These are dates, address fields, taxonomy terms, and so on. So you can do it from the user interface if you want as well. Something that I want to show is the difference, how different these things are. So before, I was running from a CSV file, my migrations, and these one are from JSON files. So if I were to compare the two, this is what is different. I am on my left, I see the JSON migration. On my right, I see the CSV migration. So the ID is different because, as I said before, every migration in your project needs to have a different value. So that is different. The label is a little bit different, just to identify that one is coming from JSON files and another one is coming from CSV file. There is some migration group that is something that is provided by the Migrate Plus module that allows you to share configuration. For example, if I am going to be migrating from the same JSON file, I can put that configuration to fetch data from that file in a migration group that we can show you in a moment. But basically, it's just like to get some information. But what I want to highlight is actually that the similarities are more common than the differences. My source constants are the same, basically, except for JSON and from CSV. What is expected to be different is like, in this case, I am reading from a CSV file, and in this case, I am reading from a JSON file. So that needs to be different. My source definitely has to be different. But after that, what is in the process section, the title is about the same. These are some things that I was manually changing for the example, but the title is basically the same. The mapping of the rich text field is the same, of the URLs is the same, for dates, for addresses, basically everything in the same. Like all my process operation is basically the same, except for like the machine names of the migrations that I am using. This is for paragraph migrations. And then my destination is exactly the same, my plugin and my machine name of the content type. And the migration dependencies, this is what allows you to say, okay, this node expects images and expects paragraph. So you also need to import those before or in advance. And because in this case, I am using JSON files, and in this case, I am using images and CSV files, that's a little bit different. But for the most part, it's the same. So this is another benefit of using the Migrate API. You can literally swap either the destination or the source or the process, and it will be mostly working the same. So basically, in this case, the same content, exactly the same content, it's migrated from a CSV file or from a JSON file. And what I showed before, that the migration group, this is how you define it. You have an ID, a label, a description, a source, but this is the important part. You can have shared configuration. So anything that you define here is going to be reused for any migration that is configured to be part of this group. So if I go here, I can see that I have a node migration, an image migration, a paragraph migration, and all of them are going to share the same you know, configuration to be able to read from my JSON file. So we have about 10 minutes left. So I want to make sure I leave some time for questions at the end. What I'm going to do is just like to show like the final version, I'm going to remove my migration that I was doing temporarily. And I'm going to roll back. MR stands for rollback, it's an alias. I'm going to reveal the caches for any changes to take effect. I'm going to import everything again. And after doing that, if I go to the website, I can see, again, the name is different because this is part of the example that I was showing, but everything else is the same. And basically, I am saying migrate the same information from a CSV file or from a JSON file. And with that, I just want to switch back a little bit here. So this is a summary of the syntax. You have your process, then you have the machine name of the field, the delta, if it is a multi-value field, then the subfield that you want to populate, and then any plugins that you want. If you have a process plugin change, you can have many plugins doing transformation for the same piece of data. The one important thing to remember when you have a chain like this is that only the source, only the first plugin in the change, you need to specify a source. For anything else in the change, it is assumed as your source is the value that was returned by the previous process plugins. In this case, like whatever this produces is going to be the input of this one. Whatever this produces is going to be the input of this one. And because there is nothing else in the change, whatever this produces is going to be assigned to my destination field in this case. These are some of the modules that were used in the example: Migrate Plus, Migrate Tools, Migrate Source CSV, to be able to read from CSV file. And in that URL, there are like 50 plus modules that provide functionality for Drupal migrations. I would like to say thanks to a lot of the Migrate maintainers who have helped me over the years to understand how this works. A reminder about the trainings that are happening next week online, and the website Understand Drupal, where you can find the 31 Days of Migration series and the course. And we have about 10 minutes for questions, so I'm going to be reading here. But this is the URL to the slide deck and the URL to the feedback form. So the Drupal Association would love to hear feedback for all the sessions. So I personally would like to know what you think about this presentation as well. So I'm going to leave that on the screen while I check for questions in the chat. And as I said before, all the examples that I show are already available, including documentation on how to set up the virtual machine. Well, not the virtual machine, like how to set up the quick start command to be able to execute the migrations. So let's see if we have some questions here. So there is a question saying, how would you recommend exporting from D7? So if you want to go from D7 to either Drupal 8 or Drupal 9, uh, actually the Migrate API offers a complete suite of modules specifically for that. And there is one called Migrate Upgrade that can help you automatically generate those Jumble definition files that I showed before. And with that module, you can generate the files. If you have any structural changes, for example, going from a content type to a user, or from a content type to a paragraph, or if you want to combine two fields, or if you want to split a content type. So you can use the Migrate Upgrade module to generate those files, make the modifications, execute them, and then you have, your Drupal 7 site or Drupal 6 site upgraded to Drupal 8 or 9. It is important to know that there is no need to go by Drupal 8. You can jump directly from 6 to 9 or from 7 to 9. That's something that you can do. And I would highly recommend checking out, the articles, the trainings, but in general, the Migrate Upgrade module is a complete suite of modules and plugins and everything that you need to go from Drupal 6 or 7 to Drupal 8 or Drupal 9. As of today, Drupal 8 and Drupal 9 in terms of migrations are basically exactly the same. The only reason why you might want to go with 8 and not with 9 is if you have a module that is available for Drupal 8, but it doesn't have a stable release for Drupal 9. So you would have to wait for that, or find a solution and an alternative for that module in Drupal 9. But other than that, there is really no reason to go to 8 and after go to 9. If you have to do that, you can do it, of course. And from going from 8 to 9, when all your modules are ready, are available, it's going to be a lot easier than going from 7 to 8 or 6 to 8. Another question: is migrating from one site to another or migrating from D7 to D8? I'm not very clear about the questions, but just to, to make it clear, in the examples that I showed today, I was migrating from CSV and from JSONs, but it is also possible to migrate from SQL databases, and that is what the Migrate Upgrade does. And even in Drupal core, there is modules that allow you to connect directly to your Drupal 6 or Drupal 7 database and use that as your source and read directly from the database. So uh, you can have that as an option, like connect directly to the database and upgrade from there. Let's have another question. I use VS Code. Are there plugins to help with spacing? Uh, I don't think that, I know that there is a plugin called Prettier that you can configure to automatically format your source code in different languages and different extensions. So I will check for that, if anything. But in general, just try to be careful. As you saw, when I was copying and pasting, some of the formatting was wrong. So you need to be very mindful about that. There are, let's see. Yeah, there's people sharing that there are some plugins that might help you with that. Let's see if there are any other questions. So there is a question: when changing the text area formatter, will it strip anything out of the content that does not meet the format basic HTML, for example? Yes. So the Migrate API is going to do whatever you instruct it to do. In my example, I said I want to use the basic HTML text format. So you can go modify what HTML tags, what HTML attributes are allowed in this particular basic HTML text format, and Drupal is going to strip anything that is not allowed. If you were to use, for example, plain HTML, plain text, everything is going to be escaped, for example. If you're going to use full HTML, that is probably a bad idea because you might be allowing some insecure HTML in your website coming from your migration. But basically, whatever you define as your input format, Drupal is going to respect how you have that configured in your site. See if it is basic HTML, restricted HTML, full HTML, plain text, whatever you define, Drupal is going to take care of cleaning up the way that it is defined on the website. Another question, will Migrate have better performance over feeds module? If you need to import thousands of nodes, you can multi-thread and it might be slow. So if you have so for one, as far as I understand, feeds is not like fully ported out for Drupal 8 and Drupal 9. I might be wrong. But in terms of performance of the Migrate API, one thing that you need to be aware of is that the Migrate API is going to be working with other parts of Drupal. And in particular, if you are creating nodes, that is, you're going to be executing node save operations, like at the entity level. It is possible, for example, to turn on validation if you want, but in general, there are many things that might happen. My recommendation when you have to migrate a lot of content is that you can do it in chunks. For example, migrate 1,000 at a time. And one way to do that is the drush command that I was executing. You can pass an extra flag called limit to say how many elements you want to import at the same time. There are other more advanced concepts. One is called high watermark that allows you to say, I'm going to be migrating 1,000 elements at a time. And the next time that you execute, pick up from when you last left in the migration. And in that regard, you can avoid timeout operations from just executing a very long running migration. But normally that is what you do. If you have big data sets, you break them down into smaller chunks, like 1,000, for example, at a time. And using something like the high watermark, you can schedule those migrations to happen, let's say, every 5 minutes. And they will be picking up where the last migration left. Let's see if there are any other questions. Migrating paragraph. So if you need to migrate paragraph, what you need to do, it's actually one of the easiest migration to start, but things start to get complicated depending on how your paragraph structure is. So this is a paragraph migration that you can run the example yourself, but basically my source is the same from before. I have a CSV file. I simply change the path to the CSV file and specify the corresponding ID. My destination, I use entity reference revision column paragraph. That's how you do it. And then the default bundle is the machine name of the paragraph that you want to migrate. And then this is the field mapping. So in my paragraph, I have a title field and an author field. So as you can see, it is not that different from a node migration. This is how you can do a paragraph migration. When things start to get a little bit complicated is how to connect once you imported the paragraph to the node. So the way to do that is using a plugin called Migration Lookup. So what this plugin allows you to do is say, I know that I already migrated something in a different migration, and I want to connect that to my node migration. In this case, I am using many things at once. I am using the migration lookup plugin to connect to the paragraph migration. I am using something that is called a pseudo field. And then this is my paragraph field. So paragraph fields are different to other reference fields in that you need to specify two things. One is called the target ID, and the other one is called target revision ID. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. Any other reference field is only the target ID, so it's easier to manage. This migration lookup is going to return an array of two values, and I am basically using the extract plugin from my pseudo field. When you have a pseudo field and you want to use it as your source, you put an @ sign at the beginning and single quotes around it. And then, this array, I want to extract the first element, and I want to extract the second element. And this is one way to populate paragraph, but there are many other ways. Things start to get complicated when you have nested paragraph, when you have paragraphs that might have revisions, when you have paragraphs that might have translations, when you have multi-value paragraph. That's when you need to come up with these like nested structures. Sometimes you might have to do like recursive migrations or process plugins that do a recursive operation in your data. But like migrating paragraph itself is simple in the sense that this is how you do it. The destination you specify is like this, your source as you would do otherwise, and this is your field mapping. Once your paragraph are into the system, you connect them to your node in this case, like this, for example, and things start to get complicated when you have multi-value, nested paragraph and so on. Let's see if there are any other questions. Yeah, there is a comment saying that you can set dependencies between entity reference, and yes, you can do that. Usually when you have an entity reference, you have a separate migration only for that, like in this case, only for my images and only for my paragraph. And this is one way that you can explicitly, at the Migrate API level, say that you want to execute these migrations in advance, because your node migrations depends on these other two. And I think that's it. So thank you very much. Remember that the slide deck, the example, everything is already available. So feel free to try it out yourself, and you have my email. If you have questions, you can reach out later. And that is the link also to the feedback form for the Drupal Association to let them know how I did. So I would appreciate your feedback. And thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day or night. Bye.